This dramatization is based on real events, but some details have been changed to protect the privacy of those involved. The purpose is educational, showing how seemingly minor conflicts can escalate when dialogue and understanding are abandoned. In the winter of 1988, Detroit stood as a city caught between its industrial past and an uncertain future. The automotive industry's decline had left deep scars across neighborhoods where churches served not just as places of worship, but as pillars holding communities together against economic devastation and social decay. This is the story of how faith, money, and power collided in ways that would forever change the religious landscape of Detroit's East Side. What began as missing donation funds escalated into accusations, confrontations, and ultimately an incident that shocked a community built on Christian brotherhood. Through interviews with former congregation members, church leaders, and community witnesses, we piece together the events that led 9 respected preachers into conflict with the very choir that once brought their congregations together in harmony. This investigation explores not the violence itself, but the human motivations, institutional failures, and lasting wounds that followed. Some names have been changed to protect privacy. The deeper truth lies not in who was right or wrong, but in understanding how desperation and broken trust can transform even the most sacred spaces into battlegrounds. Before we begin, we'd like to ask you to tell us your name and the city you're watching from. We love getting to know our audience. Also, please don't forget to give this video a like, share it with others, and subscribe to our channel. That way, we can keep bringing you more stories like this one. The snow fell heavy on Gratiot Avenue that December morning in 1988, coating the skeletal remains of abandoned storefronts and the proud facades of churches that refused to surrender to Detroit's economic collapse. 7 blocks of what locals called Gospel Row housed 14 different congregations, each fighting to keep their doors open as unemployment soared past 30% in the surrounding neighborhoods. At the heart of this religious district stood Mount Calvary Baptist Church, home to the Detroit Unity Gospel Choir, a 50-voice ensemble that had become something of a miracle itself. Founded 3 years earlier by choir director Marcus Washington, the group had achieved what many thought impossible, bringing together singers from competing congregations to create something larger than their individual church loyalties. Marcus had this vision, recalls Dorothy Jenkins, who sang alto in the choir for 2 years before the incident. She speaks slowly, choosing her words carefully as she sits in the living room of her Corktown apartment. Now 73 years old, with hands that still move expressively when she talks about music. He said God's voice shouldn't be divided by church walls. We were supposed to be one body, one spirit. The choir rehearsed Tuesday and Thursday evenings at Mount Calvary, drawing singers from 9 different churches along the Strip. They performed monthly concerts that packed whichever sanctuary hosted them, with donations split among participating congregations based on how many singers each church contributed. It was an elegant system that had generated over $40,000 for the collective churches since 1985. Marcus Washington, then 34 years old, had grown up in Detroit during the city's golden age, when automotive jobs provided stable middle-class incomes and churches competed over building size rather than survival. The son of a Ford plant supervisor and a church organist, he'd earned a music degree from Wayne State before watching his hometown transform into something he barely recognized. Marcus understood what we were all facing, explains Reverend James Coleman, who led Greater Hope Missionary Baptist and contributed 7 singers to the Unity Choir. Coleman, now retired and speaking from his home in Southfield, was 41 in 1988 and one of the younger pastors in the collective. Churches were closing every month. Families were leaving the city. Those of us who stayed, we had to work together, or we'd all go under separately. The arrangement worked beautifully for nearly 3 years. The choir's reputation grew beyond Detroit's city limits, drawing audiences from as far as Ann Arbor and Grand Rapids. Their recording of traditional spirituals had sold modestly but steadily at performances and through local Christian bookstores. Most importantly, the monthly concerts consistently raised between $3,000 and $5,000 that helped keep 9 churches operational. But success bred complexity, and complexity bred suspicion. By late 1987, tensions had begun forming around the edges of the collaboration. Some congregation members questioned why their church's best singers spent rehearsal time serving other pastors' missions. Others wondered whether donations were being split fairly, especially as some churches contributed more singers while others provided better marketing or hosting capabilities. People started counting, admits Sarah Mitchell, who managed donations for the choir and attended Friendship Baptist. Now living in Atlanta, she agreed to speak by phone, but asked that her maiden name not be used. How many singers from each church showed up to rehearsal? How much money each concert raised? Who got credit when newspapers wrote about us? When you're struggling to survive, you notice everything. The first serious crack in the unity appeared in November 1987, when Mount Calvary's pastor Robert Hayes announced his church would host the choir's Christmas concert, a prestigious booking that typically raised more money than any other performance of the year. 3 other pastors had expected to rotate hosting duties, but Hayes claimed the decision had been made by mutual agreement during a meeting that 2 of them insisted they'd never attended. "That's when I knew we had problems," recalls Coleman. Robert had always been territorial about his church, but this felt different, more calculated, like he was positioning himself as the choir's primary sponsor instead of just another participant. The Christmas concert proceeded as planned, raising nearly $8,000, a record for the group, but the celebration was muted. Behind the scenes, phone calls flew between pastors questioning how decisions were being made and whether Marcus Washington was favoring Mount Calvary's interests over the collective good. Marcus, for his part, seemed increasingly caught between loyalties he'd never intended to divide. Friends from that period describe a man under growing pressure, trying to balance artistic vision with political realities he'd never wanted to navigate. "He just wanted to make music," remembers Dorothy Jenkins. But when you're dealing with 9 different churches, 9 different pastors, 9 different sets of expectations, music becomes politics, whether you want it to or not. January 1988 brought new complications. The choir had been invited to perform at a Black History Month celebration in Grand Rapids, a significant opportunity that would expose them to potential new audiences and donors. But the invitation came with travel expenses and overnight lodging costs that would need to be covered up front. The pastors met on a frigid Tuesday evening in Mount Calvary's basement fellowship hall to discuss funding the trip. What should have been a simple financial planning session became a 3-hour argument over control, representation, and whether the choir had grown beyond its original mission of serving local congregations. "Some of us felt like the tail was wagging the dog," explains Reverend Thomas Wright, who pastored New Jerusalem AME and contributed 12 singers to the choir. Wright, now deceased, gave this interview to a Detroit Free Press reporter in 1991, and his widow provided permission to use his quotes. "We started this to help our churches survive, but it felt like our churches were becoming feeders for Marcus's bigger ambitions." The Grand Rapids trip was ultimately funded through individual donations from choir members, but the meeting had exposed deeper philosophical divisions. Some pastors wanted to expand the choir's reach and professionalism. Others preferred keeping it local and church-focused. Marcus found himself pulled in every direction, trying to satisfy constituencies with increasingly incompatible visions. By February 1988, the Tuesday and Thursday rehearsals had become exercises in managing tension rather than celebrating unity. Singers noticed their pastors' conflicts filtering down into the choir's dynamics. Churches that had once enthusiastically promoted each other's events grew quieter about cross-promotion. The easy fellowship that had characterized the early years felt strained, artificial. "We kept singing together, but we weren't really together anymore," reflects Dorothy Jenkins. "You could feel it in the harmonies. When people's hearts aren't unified, their voices aren't either." The breaking point came in March, though nobody recognized it at the time. The choir's monthly concert was scheduled for the 3rd Sunday at Friendship Baptist, Sarah Mitchell's home church. 2 weeks before the performance, Mitchell discovered a discrepancy in the donation records that would eventually unravel everything the Detroit Unity Gospel Choir had built. Sarah Mitchell had always been meticulous with numbers. As the office manager for a small accounting firm on 8 Mile Road, she brought the same attention to detail to her volunteer work, managing the Detroit Unity Gospel Choir's donation records. Every concert, every offering, every expense was logged in a composition notebook she kept locked in her desk at Friendship Baptist Church. On the evening of March 8, 1988, while preparing financial reports for the upcoming concert, Sarah noticed something that made her stomach drop. The February concert at New Jerusalem AME had officially raised $4,047, according to the deposit slip Pastor Wright had provided. But Sarah's count of the actual cash and checks collected that night totaled $4,092, a difference of $545. At first I thought I'd made a mistake, Sarah recalls, her voice still carrying traces of the anxiety she felt that night 35 years ago. I recounted everything 3 times. I checked my addition. I even called my supervisor at work to double-check my math on a calculator, but the numbers didn't lie. Sarah's discovery launched her into a sleepless investigation that consumed the next week. She drove to each participating church, requesting copies of deposit records and receipts. What she found painted a troubling picture that extended far beyond a single missing $545. The January concert at Greater Hope had shown a similar discrepancy, $623 unaccounted for. The December Christmas concert at Mount Calvary revealed the largest gap, $1 to $247 missing from what should have been their most profitable performance. Going back through 18 months of records, Sarah identified nearly $4,000 in donations that had been collected but never properly distributed to the churches. I felt sick, Sarah remembers. These weren't huge amounts for a big organization, but for churches barely keeping their heat on, $4,000 might as well have been $40,000. That money was supposed to help families, pay utility bills, keep doors open. Sarah's first instinct was to approach Marcus Washington directly. She respected the choir director and assumed the discrepancies resulted from honest accounting errors rather than deliberate theft. But Marcus's response planted the first seeds of suspicion that would eventually grow into accusations threatening the entire collaborative arrangement. He got defensive immediately, Sarah recalls. Before I could even finish explaining what I'd found, he was telling me I didn't understand how concert finances worked, that there were always expenses I wasn't seeing, that I should trust the pastors to handle church business. Marcus's reaction struck Sarah as particularly odd because she'd worked with him on financial matters for 2 years without any conflict. He'd always appreciated her thoroughness and had frequently praised her organizational skills to other choir members. This sudden dismissiveness felt out of character and deeply concerning. Unsure how to proceed, Sarah made a decision that would prove fateful. She scheduled individual meetings with each of the 9 pastors to present her findings privately before taking any collective action. She hoped to resolve the matter quietly while giving everyone involved the benefit of the doubt. Her first meeting was with Reverend Coleman at Greater Hope Missionary Baptist. Coleman listened carefully to Sarah's presentation, examined her documentation, and asked several pointed questions that suggested he was taking the matter seriously. But his final response surprised her. James told me he'd had his own suspicions for months, Sarah explains. He said Mount Calvary had been handling too much of the money management and that Robert Hayes had been evasive when asked for detailed financial records. He basically confirmed that I wasn't imagining problems. The meeting with Pastor Hayes at Mount Calvary proved far more confrontational. Hayes, a charismatic preacher who'd built his congregation from 30 members to over 200 during his 8-year tenure, didn't appreciate having his church's financial integrity questioned by someone he considered an outsider. Robert was furious, Sarah recalls. He accused me of trying to destroy the choir out of jealousy because Friendship Baptist wasn't as successful as Mount Calvary. He said I was spreading rumors that could hurt all of our churches. He actually suggested that I was the one stealing money and trying to blame others to cover my tracks. Hayes' aggressive response convinced Sarah that the missing donations represented more than accounting errors. His immediate shift to personal attacks, rather than addressing the financial discrepancies, felt like the behavior of someone with something to hide. More troubling, Hayes claimed that Mount Calvary had been covering various choir expenses that justified keeping larger portions of donations, but he refused to provide documentation of these alleged expenses. Word of Sarah's investigation began spreading through the network of churches despite her attempts at discretion. Pastor Wright at New Jerusalem AME called her 2 days after her meeting with Hayes, warning that rumors were circulating about her attacking the choir's leadership. Other pastors began taking sides before they'd even seen Sarah's evidence or understood the scope of the missing funds. It became political immediately, Sarah explains. Some pastors supported Robert because Mount Calvary was the largest and most influential church in our group. Others resented Mount Calvary's dominance and saw this as an opportunity to challenge Robert's control. Nobody seemed focused on the actual missing money anymore. Marcus Washington found himself caught in the middle of a conflict he'd never anticipated. Choir members began approaching him with questions about the financial allegations, while pastors demanded that he either support Sarah's investigation or denounce it as harmful gossip. The artistic leader who'd built his reputation on bringing churches together suddenly faced pressure to choose sides in a battle that threatened to destroy everything he'd created. Marcus looked terrible during that period, remembers Dorothy Jenkins. He'd lost weight, seemed constantly stressed, kept having private phone conversations before and after rehearsals. The music suffered because his mind was obviously elsewhere. The situation deteriorated further when Reverend Patricia Moore of Zion Hill Baptist Church announced that her congregation was withdrawing from the choir until these financial questions are resolved. Moore, one of only 2 female pastors in the collaboration, had initially supported Sarah's investigation, but grew frustrated with the increasingly hostile atmosphere surrounding the missing donations. Patricia was smart to get out when she did, reflects former choir member Robert Davis, who sang bass for Mount Calvary and witnessed many of the behind-the-scenes conflicts. She could see this was going to get ugly, and she didn't want her church dragged into whatever was coming. Moore's withdrawal created a domino effect. Within days, 2 other smaller churches announced they were taking a temporary break from choir participation. The Detroit Unity Gospel Choir, which had fielded 50 singers just weeks earlier, suddenly found itself reduced to 37 members representing only 6 churches. But the most damaging development came from an unexpected source: Deacon Harold Washington, no relation to Marcus, the treasurer at Greater Hope Missionary Baptist. Harold had been reviewing his own church's records following Sarah's meetings with Pastor Coleman, and discovered additional irregularities that painted an even darker picture of the choir's financial management. Harold found evidence that some donations hadn't just been miscounted, they'd been deliberately redirected, explains Coleman, speaking carefully about allegations that were never fully proven. Money that should have been split among all 9 churches had instead been sent to accounts controlled by Mount Calvary, with no explanation or documentation. Harold Washington's findings suggested a level of financial manipulation that went far beyond the accounting errors Sarah had initially suspected. If his evidence was accurate, someone had been systematically skimming donations for over a year, using Mount Calvary's administrative role to hide the theft from other participating churches. The revelation transformed the conflict from a dispute over missing money into accusations of deliberate fraud. Churches that had been willing to assume good faith and work toward resolution suddenly faced the possibility that their collaboration had been exploited by someone they'd trusted with their congregation's financial welfare. Marcus Washington, perhaps recognizing that his position had become untenable, made a desperate attempt to salvage the situation. He called a meeting of all remaining choir participants for Thursday, March 24, 1988, at Mount Calvary's Fellowship Hall. His stated goal was to clear the air and restore unity, but the gathering would instead become the flashpoint for everything that followed. Marcus thought he could bring everyone together and work things out, Dorothy Jenkins remembers. He still believed in the power of music and fellowship to overcome human conflicts, but some problems are too big for good intentions to solve. The meeting was scheduled for 7 p.m. after the usual Thursday rehearsal. Word spread through the participating churches that this would be the decisive gathering, the moment when the Detroit Unity Gospel Choir would either overcome its crisis or officially dissolve. What nobody anticipated was that the meeting would become a confrontation that would end with police involvement and newspaper headlines. As Thursday afternoon approached, tensions that had been building for weeks reached a breaking point. Sarah Mitchell had compiled a comprehensive report documenting over $5,000 in missing donations. Harold Washington had evidence suggesting deliberate financial manipulation. Pastor Hayes was reportedly preparing his own defense, claiming that Mount Calvary had been unfairly targeted by jealous competitors. Most ominously, word had spread that some church members were planning to attend the meeting despite it being intended for pastors and choir leadership only. The intimate discussion Marcus had envisioned threatened to become a public confrontation, involving dozens of angry congregation members who'd lost trust in their religious leaders' ability to handle the crisis responsibly. People were fed up, explains Robert Davis. Churches were struggling to survive. Families were losing their homes. And then we find out that money meant to help our communities might have been stolen by people we trusted. There was a lot of anger that had nothing to do with the choir specifically. This just became the place where it all came out. The stage was set for a confrontation that would expose the deepest fractures in Detroit's religious community and forever change how the participating churches related to each other. What had begun as Sarah Mitchell's careful investigation of accounting discrepancies was about to become something much larger and more destructive. Thursday evening arrived with unseasonably warm weather that melted the last of March snow into muddy slush on Gratiot Avenue. As 6 o'clock approached, cars began parking outside Mount Calvary Baptist Church, far more cars than a simple choir meeting should have required. The Detroit Unity Gospel Choir was about to hold its final gathering, though none of the participants fully understood what they were walking into that night. The fellowship hall at Mount Calvary Baptist Church had hosted countless gatherings over the years. Wedding receptions, community dinners, holiday celebrations that brought Detroit's East Side together in fellowship and joy. But on the evening of March 24, 1988, the basement room felt charged with a tension that transformed familiar surroundings into something alien and threatening. By 6:45 p.m., nearly 70 people had crowded into a space designed for 40. What Marcus Washington had planned as a private meeting between choir leadership and participating pastors had somehow expanded into a community-wide confrontation. Word had spread through church networks with the speed and distortion that only gossip can achieve, bringing concerned congregation members, curious neighbors, and even a few individuals with no direct connection to any of the churches involved. Fire felt like a powder keg waiting to explode, recalls Dorothy Jenkins, who arrived early hoping to claim a seat near the front. People were clustering in groups based on which church they attended, whispering among themselves, shooting suspicious looks at members from other congregations. The unity we'd worked so hard to build had completely evaporated. Sarah Mitchell entered the hall at exactly 7 p.m., carrying a manila folder containing 18 months of financial documentation. She'd spent the week since her discovery organizing evidence with the methodical precision she brought to her professional accounting work, creating charts and summaries that would clearly demonstrate the pattern of missing donations. But as she surveyed the crowded room, Sarah realized that her careful preparation might be irrelevant in what was clearly going to be an emotional rather than rational discussion. I'd expected maybe 15 people, the choir directors and pastors, Sarah explains. Instead, I walked into what looked like a town hall meeting gone wrong. People were angry before anyone had even spoken. You could feel it in the air. Marcus Washington stood at the front of the room, visibly uncomfortable with the size and mood of the crowd he'd inadvertently assembled. The choir director, who'd spent 3 years building bridges between competing congregations, now faced the collapse of everything he'd worked to create. His usual confidence had been replaced by nervous energy as he repeatedly checked his watch and shuffled through notes he'd prepared for a much different kind of gathering. Pastor Robert Hayes sat prominently in the front row, flanked by 6 Mount Calvary deacons and trustees who'd positioned themselves like a defensive barrier around their church leader. Hayes had always been a commanding presence, a tall man with a deep voice and natural charisma who could hold an audience's attention through force of personality alone. But tonight, his usual ease seemed forced, his smile strained, as if he understood that his reputation and perhaps his ministry hung in the balance of the next few hours. The other pastors had scattered themselves throughout the room rather than sitting together. a seating arrangement that spoke volumes about the breakdown of collegiality that had once characterized their collaboration. Reverend Coleman from Greater Hope sat near the back with Harold Washington, the deacon whose financial investigation had escalated the crisis beyond simple accounting errors. Pastor Wright from New Jerusalem AME had claimed a middle-row seat, but kept glancing toward the exit, clearly uncomfortable with the volatile atmosphere. At 7:15 p.m., Marcus finally called the meeting to order, though his attempts to establish calm were repeatedly interrupted by side conversations and whispered arguments that had already begun among the crowd. His opening remarks, intended to emphasize unity and Christian brotherhood, fell flat in a room where trust had already been irreparably damaged. Marcus tried to pretend this was just a misunderstanding that could be resolved through prayer and discussion, remembers Robert Davis, who attended as both a Mount Calvary member and choir participant. But everyone knew we were past the point where good intentions could fix what had been broken. The damage was too deep, the accusations too serious. Sarah Mitchell was the first person called to present her findings. Walking to the front of the room with her folder of evidence, she faced an audience that had already divided into factions before hearing a word of her evidence. Mount Calvary supporters sat with arms crossed and skeptical expressions, while members from other churches leaned forward with anticipation, eager to hear confirmation of suspicions many had harbored for months. Sarah's presentation was methodical and devastating. Reading directly from her documentation, she outlined 18 separate instances where recorded donations exceeded the amounts actually distributed to participating churches. The missing funds totaled 5,240 svendois, a substantial sum that represented months of utility payments, building maintenance, and community outreach programs that the churches desperately needed. I tried to keep emotion out of it, Sarah recalls. I presented the numbers, showed the documentation, explained my methodology. I wanted people to focus on the facts rather than personalities, but you could see people getting angrier with every discrepancy I revealed. The most damaging evidence came from Harold Washington's supplementary investigation. The Greater Hope deacon had discovered that several large donations, including an $800 contribution from a visiting congregation and a $650 memorial gift, had been deposited into accounts controlled exclusively by Mount Calvary rather than split among participating churches as the choir's agreement required. Harold's findings suggested deliberate deception rather than accounting errors. Bank records showed that Pastor Hayes had personally signed deposit slips directing these funds to Mount Calvary accounts, despite explicit agreements that all choir donations would be distributed based on each church's participation level. When Harold presented that evidence, the room went completely silent, remembers Coleman. Everyone understood that we weren't talking about mistakes anymore. Someone had been deliberately stealing from churches that could barely afford to keep their doors open. Pastor Hayes' response to the allegations revealed a man under extreme pressure who decided that aggressive denial offered his best chance of survival. Rather than addressing the specific financial evidence, Hayes launched into a passionate defense of his character and Mount Calvary's contributions to the choir collaboration. Robert tried to make it about everything except the missing money, explains Dorothy Jenkins. He talked about Mount Calvary providing rehearsal space, about his personal sacrifices for the choir, about how other pastors were jealous of his church's success. But he never directly answered the questions about where those donations had gone. Hayes' strategy backfired spectacularly. His evasiveness convinced many audience members that the allegations were true, while his attacks on other pastors' motivations infuriated people who'd come seeking honest answers about missing funds that belonged to their congregations. The confrontation escalated when Deacon James Miller from Friendship Baptist stood up and directly accused Hayes of theft. Miller, a retired auto worker who'd lost his pension when his plant closed, had donated $50 to the choir's Christmas concert, money his family needed for groceries. Learning that his contribution might have been stolen rather than used for its intended religious purpose had filled him with a rage that overrode normal Christian courtesy. "You took money from families who don't have money to give," Miller shouted, pointing directly at Hayes. "You stole from people who trusted you with their church's future. That's not just theft. That's a sin against God and your community." Hayes rose to respond, his own anger finally breaking through the careful composure he'd maintained throughout the evening. "I don't have to listen to accusations from people who've never built anything, never led anything, never sacrificed anything for their faith," he shot back. "Mount Calvary has done more for this community than any church in this room, and I won't apologize for ensuring our congregation gets the support it deserves." The exchange between Miller and Hayes shattered any remaining pretense of Christian fellowship. Voices rose throughout the room as congregation members began shouting support for their respective pastors and accusations at opposing churches. The careful documentation Sarah had prepared became irrelevant as the gathering devolved into emotional confrontations between people whose trust in each other had completely collapsed. Marcus Washington made increasingly desperate attempts to restore order, but his authority had been undermined by weeks of conflict and his perceived inability to prevent the financial crisis that had destroyed the choir's unity. The man who'd once commanded respect from 9 different congregations now couldn't control a single room full of angry Christians. Marcus kept calling for calm, asking people to remember their Christian values, trying to get everyone to pray together, recalls Davis. But when you've got 70 people convinced that someone has stolen from their churches, prayer doesn't seem like an adequate response. The situation reached a breaking point when Pastor Wright attempted to leave the meeting early, stating that New Jerusalem AME was withdrawing permanently from any collaboration with churches that couldn't account for their financial stewardship. As Wright moved toward the exit, several Mount Calvary members blocked his path, demanding that he apologize for spreading lies about their pastor. Thomas tried to push past them politely, but they wouldn't move, Coleman explains. Then someone grabbed his arm, and that's when everything went crazy. The physical confrontation began with shoving and harsh words, but quickly escalated as more people joined the altercation. Deacon Miller rushed to Wright's defense, pushing away the Mount Calvary members who'd blocked the exit. Hayes's supporters responded by surrounding Miller, creating a chaotic scuffle that drew in participants from multiple churches. Dorothy Jenkins found herself pressed against a wall as the crowd surged around the developing fight. People were screaming, pushing, trying to protect their pastors or attack other churches' members, she remembers. It was chaos, complete chaos. Everything we'd built together was being destroyed in front of our eyes. The confrontation might have remained limited to shoving and angry words, but the situation spiraled further when someone, witnesses disagree about who, threw a folding chair that struck Reverend Coleman in the shoulder. The sight of a respected pastor being physically attacked galvanized both sides, transforming a chaotic argument into something approaching a riot. Mount Calvary members rallied to defend their church against what they perceived as an organized attack by jealous competitors. Members from other congregations responded by protecting their own pastors, while expressing years of accumulated resentment about Mount Calvary's dominance in the collaboration. The financial allegations that had brought everyone together became secondary to tribal loyalties that overrode Christian brotherhood. Marcus Washington later described those moments as watching my life's work destroy itself. The choir director, who dedicated 3 years to building unity between competing churches, now witnessed those same people attacking each other with a violence that seemed to negate everything they claimed to believe about Christian love and forgiveness. The chaos continued for nearly 10 minutes before cooler heads began pulling combatants apart and establishing some semblance of order. But by then, the damage extended far beyond hurt feelings and wounded pride. Several people had suffered minor injuries, church property had been damaged, and most seriously, someone had called the Detroit Police Department to report a riot at Mount Calvary Baptist Church. The arrival of 2 patrol cars at 8:23 p.m. brought the confrontation to an abrupt end. Officers entering the fellowship hall found 70 disheveled adults attempting to restore order while avoiding eye contact with members of opposing churches. The scene bore no resemblance to any religious gathering the responding officers had ever encountered. When the police walked in, everyone suddenly remembered they were supposed to be Christians, recalls Sarah Mitchell. People started apologizing, trying to clean up overturned chairs, acting like nothing had happened. But you can't pretend away that level of conflict. Everyone knew something fundamental had been broken. The police report filed that evening described the incident as a dispute over church finances that escalated into disorderly conduct. No arrests were made, though officers took statements from several participants and advised church leaders to resolve their differences through appropriate legal channels rather than public confrontations. For the Detroit Unity Gospel Choir, the March 24th meeting represented an ending rather than a resolution. The collaboration that had once brought together 50 singers from 9 churches officially dissolved that night, though no formal announcement was ever made. Participating churches simply stopped attending rehearsals, stopped promoting joint concerts, and stopped acknowledging their former partnership. "We never sang together again," Dorothy Jenkins reflects sadly. 3 years of music, fellowship, and shared mission ended in one terrible evening. It broke my heart then, and it still breaks my heart now. But the confrontation at Mount Calvary represented more than just the end of a choir. It exposed deep fractures in Detroit's religious community that extended far beyond the specific allegations against Pastor Hayes. Churches that had once supported each other through the city's economic crisis now viewed each other with suspicion and hostility that would persist for years. The missing $5,204 was never recovered. Pastor Hayes continued leading Mount Calvary Baptist Church for another 6 months before accepting a position with a congregation in Atlanta, citing new opportunities for ministry rather than acknowledging the financial scandal that had destroyed his Detroit reputation. His departure was seen by many as an admission of guilt, though he never faced formal charges or acknowledged wrongdoing. The other participating churches struggled to rebuild their individual congregations after losing the financial support and community connections the choir had provided. 2 smaller churches closed within 18 months of the confrontation, unable to survive without the collaborative resources they'd relied upon since 1985. As participants left Mount Calvary that March evening, walking past police cars and broken fellowship, few could have imagined the lasting impact their conflict would have on Detroit's East Side religious community. What had begun as Sarah Mitchell's discovery of accounting discrepancies had exposed fundamental questions about trust, leadership, and the intersection of faith with financial necessity that would influence how churches related to each other for decades to come. The Detroit Unity Gospel Choir's final performance had been chaos rather than music, discord rather than harmony. But in the silence that followed, difficult questions about religious leadership, community accountability, and the human capacity for both unity and destruction would demand answers that never fully came. The Detroit Free Press headline on March 26, 1988 read simply, "Church Dispute Leads to Police Response." Buried on page 7 of the Metro section, the brief article described the incident at Mount Calvary Baptist Church as a disagreement over financial matters that had required police intervention to restore order. The understated coverage reflected both the newspaper's reluctance to sensationalize religious conflicts and the participants' collective desire to minimize public attention to what they considered a private community matter. But within Detroit's East Side religious community, the confrontation sent shockwaves that reverberated far beyond the 9 churches directly involved in the Detroit Unity Gospel Choir collaboration. Word of the incident spread through informal networks with the speed and distortion typical of church gossip, creating multiple versions of events that often bore little resemblance to what had actually occurred in Mount Calvary's fellowship hall. Everyone had an opinion about what had happened, but most people weren't there to see it, recalls Reverend Diana Foster, who pastored Bethel AME Church on Van Dyke Avenue and had watched the choir collaboration from outside. The stories got wilder with each telling. By the end of the week, people were saying there had been fistfights, that thousands of dollars had been stolen, that the whole thing was part of some larger conspiracy between competing churches. The rumor mill's distortions created additional problems for churches already struggling with the aftermath of the confrontation. Congregation members who hadn't attended the March 24th meeting began questioning their own pastor's involvement in the incident, while potential new members stayed away from churches they'd heard were involved in financial scandals and physical altercations. Mount Calvary Baptist Church bore the heaviest burden of public scrutiny. Pastor Robert Hayes' aggressive defense of his church's financial practices had convinced many observers that the allegations against him were true, even though no formal investigation had proven wrongdoing. Attendance at Sunday services dropped noticeably in the weeks following the confrontation, as longtime members wrestled with doubts about their spiritual leader's integrity. Robert tried to act like nothing had changed, remembers Deacon Charles Thompson, who served on Mount Calvary's Board of Trustees for 15 years before the incident. He preached the same passionate sermons, ran the same programs, maintained the same confidence he'd always shown. But you could see the strain wearing on him. The joy had gone out of his ministry, even when he was trying to hide it. Hayes's position became increasingly untenable as more congregation members learned details about the missing donations. The $5,247 that Sarah Mitchell had documented represented a substantial sum for a church operating on Mount Calvary's budget, but the broader implications were even more damaging. If their pastor had been willing to redirect funds from collaborative efforts, congregation members wondered what else he might have hidden from their oversight. The situation deteriorated further when Mount Calvary's own financial records came under scrutiny from the church's trustees. A comprehensive audit requested by concerned members revealed irregularities that extended beyond the choir donations, including unexplained expenses, missing receipts, and financial decisions that Hayes had made without proper authorization from the church board. The audit found about $12,000 in questionable transactions over 3 years, explains Thompson, speaking carefully about findings that were never made public at the time. Nothing that would necessarily constitute criminal behavior, but definitely a pattern of financial management that violated our church's policies and broke the trust between Robert and his congregation. The audit's findings sealed Hayes's fate at Mount Calvary, though he fought to maintain his position for several more months. The pastor who had built the congregation from 30 to over 200 members found himself defending not just his handling of choir donations, but his entire approach to church leadership and financial stewardship. Hayes's final sermon at Mount Calvary, delivered on September 18, 1988, was described by witnesses as a defiant farewell rather than a humble acknowledgement of mistakes. He spoke about persecution, about jealousy from competing churches, and about the challenges of leading a successful ministry in a failing city. But he never directly addressed the financial allegations or apologized for the conflicts that had destroyed the choir collaboration. Robert left angry, Thompson recalls. He felt like he'd been betrayed by people he'd served faithfully for 8 years. In his mind, he was the victim of a conspiracy by jealous pastors and disloyal congregation members who didn't appreciate his sacrifices for the church. Hayes's departure for Atlanta came with a severance package that some Mount Calvary members considered too generous given the circumstances of his resignation. But church leaders were eager to end the controversy and begin rebuilding their congregation's reputation. The financial cost of Hayes's departure was less important than the opportunity for a fresh start under new leadership. The other churches involved in the choir collaboration faced their own distinct challenges in the aftermath of the confrontation. Some, like Greater Hope Missionary Baptist, emerged with enhanced reputations for financial transparency and principled leadership. Reverend Coleman's support for Sarah Mitchell's investigation and his willingness to acknowledge problems had demonstrated the kind of accountability that congregation members respected. James handled the crisis exactly right, reflects former Greater Hope member Patricia Williams. He took the allegations seriously, cooperated with the investigation, and kept his congregation informed throughout the process. People trusted him more after the incident than they had before it, which says a lot about his character and leadership. But other churches struggled to recover from their association with the controversy. New Jerusalem AME Church, where Pastor Wright had been physically blocked from leaving the March 24th meeting, experienced a significant membership decline as families sought congregations with less complicated histories. Wright's decision to withdraw from the choir collaboration early had demonstrated good judgment, but couldn't shield his church from the broader damage to the religious community's reputation. The two smallest churches in the collaboration, Friendship Baptist and Rising Star Missionary Baptist, faced existential threats that extended far beyond the immediate fallout from the choir's dissolution. Both congregations had relied heavily on the additional income generated by the monthly concerts, and losing that financial support during Detroit's ongoing economic crisis pushed them toward insolvency. Friendship Baptist, Sarah Mitchell's home church, managed to survive by merging with a larger congregation on the city's west side. The merger preserved jobs for church staff and maintained services for elderly members who couldn't easily travel to distant alternatives, but it effectively ended the congregation's independent existence and its role in the East Side religious community. Rising Star Missionary Baptist wasn't as fortunate. Pastor Mary Johnson's congregation had been the smallest participant in the choir collaboration, contributing only 4 singers but benefiting significantly from the shared resources and joint programming the group provided. Without those connections, Rising Star lost members to larger churches and faced mounting debt that forced its closure in November 1988. Mary fought to keep Rising Star open until the very end, recalls former member Janet Davis. She took a second job, deferred her own salary, organized every fundraiser she could think of. But when you're a church with 30 active members trying to maintain a building designed for 200, the economics just don't work. The choir had been our lifeline, and when that ended, we couldn't survive on our own. The closure of Rising Star represented more than just the loss of another small church in a city that had already seen too many religious institutions fail. The congregation had served its neighborhood for 43 years, providing not just worship services, but community programs, emergency assistance, and social connections that helped residents cope with Detroit's economic devastation. When Rising Star closed, the whole block felt different, explains longtime resident Harold Mitchell. That church had been like the heartbeat of our neighborhood. People depended on it for more than just Sunday services. When it was gone, we lost something that couldn't be replaced by driving to some other congregation across town. The human cost of the choir's dissolution extended beyond institutional challenges to personal relationships that had been built through 3 years of musical collaboration. Singers who had become close friends found themselves divided by church loyalties and conflicting versions of events they'd witnessed. Some maintained private friendships despite their church's official estrangement, but many relationships ended completely. Dorothy Jenkins, who had sung alto in the choir since its founding, struggled with depression for months after the collaboration ended. The twice-weekly rehearsals had provided structure, purpose, and social connection during a period when her own life was marked by unemployment and family problems. Losing that support system felt almost as devastating as the broader community conflicts that had caused it. The choir had been my escape, Dorothy explains. When I was singing, I could forget about bill collectors, job applications, all the stress that came with trying to survive in Detroit during those years. The music lifted me up, made me feel like I was part of something beautiful and meaningful. When that ended, I had to find other ways to cope, and it took a long time. Marcus Washington faced perhaps the greatest personal and professional challenges in the aftermath of the choir's collapse. The musical director who had built his reputation on bringing churches together found himself unemployable in Detroit's religious community, where his association with the financial scandal made him a liability rather than an asset to potential employers. Marcus became radioactive, explains Robert Davis, who maintained a friendship with the former choir director despite the controversy. Churches were afraid to hire him because they thought it might associate them with the whole mess. He was guilty by association, even though he'd never been accused of stealing money or causing the conflicts that destroyed the collaboration. Washington eventually left Detroit for a position with a church in Cleveland, where his musical talents were appreciated by congregations unfamiliar with the Michigan controversy. But the move represented a significant step backward in his career trajectory, and friends say he never fully recovered from the collapse of his signature achievement. Marcus had dreamed of expanding the Detroit Unity Gospel Choir into something regional, maybe even national, Davis recalls. He talked about recording albums, touring other cities, showing the world what could be accomplished when churches worked together. Instead, he ended up starting over in a new city, trying to rebuild credibility he'd spent years establishing. The investigation into the missing choir donations never produced the definitive answers that participants had hoped to achieve. Sarah Mitchell's documentation clearly demonstrated that funds had been diverted, and Harold Washington's bank records suggested deliberate financial manipulation. But without cooperation from Mount Calvary's leadership and with Pastor Hayes's departure from Detroit, Law enforcement agencies showed little interest in pursuing what they considered a civil rather than criminal matter. The police basically told us it was a church dispute that should be handled through internal processes or civil litigation, explains Coleman. They weren't going to investigate alleged theft unless we could provide evidence of criminal intent, which was difficult to prove when the person with access to the relevant records had left town. The lack of formal accountability frustrated choir members and congregation participants who felt that Hayes's departure to Atlanta represented an escape from consequences rather than appropriate resolution of the financial irregularities. Without official findings of wrongdoing, rumors and speculation continued to circulate, preventing the kind of closure that might have allowed healing to begin. Several churches considered pursuing civil litigation to recover the missing donations, but legal costs and uncertain outcomes discouraged formal legal action. The amount of money involved, while significant for struggling congregations, wasn't large enough to justify expensive court proceedings that might drag on for years without guaranteed success. We talked to lawyers, but they basically told us we'd spend more money on legal fees than we could ever recover, Thompson explains. And even if we won a judgment, Robert was gone and might not have assets we could collect against. It felt like throwing good money after bad. The absence of legal resolution left participating churches to seek healing through other means. Some congregations organized their own memorial services for the collaboration, acknowledging both the positive accomplishments of the choir's early years and the sadness of its destructive ending. Others focused on rebuilding their individual ministries without dwelling on the conflicts that had divided their community. But the broader questions raised by the Detroit Unity Gospel Choir's collapse continued to influence how East Side churches approached collaborative efforts. The incident had demonstrated both the potential benefits and serious risks of interchurch cooperation, particularly when financial resources and leadership authority became concentrated in ways that created opportunities for abuse. The whole experience made everyone more cautious about working together, reflects Coleman. Churches that might have collaborated on community programs or shared resources became more protective of their independence. Trust, once broken, takes a long time to rebuild. The legacy of the choir controversy extended into the 1990s and beyond, shaping how Detroit's religious community responded to subsequent crises and opportunities for cooperation. Churches that survived the city's continued economic decline often did so by maintaining strict financial controls and avoiding the kind of collaborative arrangements that had made the Unity Choir both successful and vulnerable. Some positive changes emerged from the tragedy. Churches that had learned about the importance of financial transparency began implementing more rigorous accounting procedures and oversight mechanisms. Congregations developed clearer policies about pastoral authority over financial decisions and board oversight of church resources. The one good thing that came out of the whole mess was that churches got serious about accountability, explains Williams. Pastors couldn't just make financial decisions without proper approval anymore. Congregation members demanded to see budgets, audit reports, documentation for major expenses. It was a painful way to learn those lessons, but the learning was important. The story of the Detroit Unity Gospel Choir also became a cautionary tale that was shared throughout Michigan's religious community and beyond. Seminary programs began incorporating case studies about the incident into coursework, about church administration and pastoral ethics. Denominational leaders used the events to illustrate the importance of maintaining appropriate boundaries between churches and implementing proper safeguards for collaborative ministries. We studied the Detroit situation in my seminary classes, recalls Pastor Jennifer Martinez, who graduated from Detroit Seminary in 1995. It became the example of how good intentions and poor oversight could destroy not just individual ministries, but entire communities' trust in religious leadership. The professors made sure we understood that accountability isn't just good practice. It's essential for maintaining the integrity that makes ministry possible. By the mid-1990s, most of the churches directly involved in the choir collaboration had either closed, merged with other congregations, or relocated to different areas of the city. The East Side neighborhood that had once supported 9 active churches within 7 blocks struggled to maintain even 2 functioning congregations, as Detroit's population continued declining and economic opportunities remained scarce. The social and cultural losses extended beyond the religious sphere. The choir had provided performance opportunities, musical education, and cultural enrichment that benefited the broader community. Local schools had invited the group to perform for student assemblies. Community organizations had relied on their services for fundraising events. Senior centers and nursing homes had enjoyed regular visits from choir members who brought both musical entertainment and personal connection to elderly residents. The choir was bigger than just the churches involved, explains community activist Robert Johnson, who had booked the Unity Choir for several neighborhood events. They were cultural ambassadors who showed the positive side of what our community could accomplish. When they disappeared, we lost something that had made our whole area feel more vibrant and hopeful. The economic impact of the choir's dissolution was also significant for the participating churches and surrounding businesses. The monthly concerts had drawn audiences from across the metropolitan area, bringing visitors who patronized local restaurants, gas stations, and other businesses. The collaboration had also generated modest income through recording sales and performance fees that helped support church operations during financially difficult times. Local music teachers and instrument suppliers lost customers when churches scaled back their musical programs following the choir's collapse. The network of musicians, sound technicians, and other professionals who had supported the Unity Choir's performances found themselves scrambling for alternative employment as demand for their services declined throughout the East Side religious community. The whole ecosystem around church music took a hit, explains instrument dealer William Foster, whose business served many of the participating congregations. Churches that had been investing in new sound equipment, instruments, and musical programs suddenly became much more conservative about those expenses. The choir's success had encouraged musical ambitions that died along with the collaboration. The personal stories of individual choir members reflected the broader community impact of the collaboration's collapse. Many singers had used their participation as a stepping stone to other musical opportunities, developing skills and connections that helped them find work with other churches, community groups, or professional ensembles. When the choir ended, those pathways to musical advancement disappeared. Some former choir members attempted to maintain musical connections through informal gatherings and smaller groups, but these efforts lacked the institutional support and community recognition that had made the Unity Choir successful. Without regular rehearsal space, promotional assistance, and the sense of purpose that came from serving multiple congregations, individual initiatives struggled to achieve sustainability. "We tried to keep singing together," Dorothy Jenkins explains. "A few of us would meet in someone's living room, practice some of the songs we'd learned, talk about maybe starting a new group. But it wasn't the same. The energy, the sense of mission, the feeling that we were building something important, that was gone." The dissolution of the Detroit Unity Gospel Choir also coincided with broader changes in Detroit's demographics and economy that made rebuilding such collaborative efforts increasingly difficult. The city's population continued declining throughout the late 1980s and 1990s, with many middle-class African-American families moving to suburbs that offered better schools, safer neighborhoods, and more economic opportunities. Churches that had once competed for members found themselves struggling to maintain basic operations as their congregations aged and shrank. The kind of ambitious collaborative programming that had characterized the choir's peak years became impossible when individual churches could barely afford to keep their doors open and maintain essential services. By the 1990s, we were in survival mode, reflects Coleman. Churches that had once worried about managing successful programs were focusing on paying utility bills and keeping roofs from leaking. The idea of pooling resources for something like a regional choir seemed like a luxury we couldn't afford. The memory of the March 24, 1988 confrontation became a defining moment for many participants, shaping their understanding of human nature, religious community, and the fragile foundations of trust that make cooperation possible. Interviews with former choir members and church leaders, conducted decades later, reveal a persistent sadness about what was lost, combined with hard-earned wisdom about the complexities of institutional relationships. "I learned that good people can do terrible things when they're desperate or scared," reflects Sarah Mitchell. "I also learned that transparency isn't just about preventing problems, it's about maintaining the trust that makes community possible. If we'd had better systems, clearer accountability, more open communication from the beginning, maybe things would have ended differently." The story of the Detroit Unity Gospel Choir's rise and fall became part of the oral history passed down within Detroit's religious community, serving as both inspiration and warning for subsequent generations of church leaders. The collaboration's early success demonstrated what could be accomplished when congregations worked together toward common goals, while its tragic ending illustrated the importance of maintaining proper safeguards and ethical standards. Contemporary pastors and church administrators who learned about the incident often expressed amazement at both the ambition of the original collaboration and the completeness of its destruction. The idea that 9 independent churches had successfully pooled resources and coordinated programming for 3 years seemed almost impossible to younger leaders who'd grown up in an era of increased institutional isolation and competition. "When I hear about the Unity Choir, it sounds like something from a different world," admits Pastor Michael Thompson, who began serving an East Side congregation in 2010. "The level of trust and cooperation they achieved seems incredible by today's standards. But the way it ended also explains why churches today are so cautious about collaborative efforts. Everyone knows that story, and nobody wants to repeat it." The financial reforms implemented by surviving churches in response to the choir controversy became models that were adopted throughout Detroit's religious community and beyond. Denominational organizations incorporated lessons learned from the incident into training programs for new pastors and church administrators, emphasizing the importance of financial transparency, board oversight, and clear policies for collaborative endeavors. The Detroit situation became a case study that influenced church governance practices across the country, explains Dr. Patricia Williams, who teaches church administration at a major seminary. "It demonstrated that good intentions weren't sufficient protection against institutional failures, and that religious organizations needed the same kinds of accountability mechanisms that secular nonprofits had been developing." The technological advances of the 1990s and 2000s made some of the financial management problems that had plagued the Unity Choir easier to prevent through electronic record keeping, automated audit trails, and real-time financial reporting. But the human elements that had contributed to the collaboration's collapse, pride, jealousy, fear, and the temptation to abuse trusted positions, remained constant challenges that no amount of technological sophistication could completely eliminate. Modern church leaders studying the Detroit Unity Gospel Choir incident often focus on communication failures that allowed small problems to escalate into major conflicts. The 3-week period between Sarah Mitchell's discovery of missing donations and the March 24 confrontation might have provided opportunities for resolution if participants had possessed better conflict resolution skills and more effective forums for addressing serious concerns. The tragedy is that this probably could have been prevented with better processes, reflects conflict resolution specialist Dr. James Anderson, who has worked with numerous churches facing internal disputes. If they'd had established procedures for handling financial irregularities, neutral mediators to facilitate difficult conversations, and clearer agreements about authority and accountability, the missing money might have been resolved without destroying the entire collaboration. The lasting impact of the Detroit Unity Gospel Choir extends beyond the immediate participants to influence broader conversations about religious community, institutional accountability, and the challenges of maintaining cooperation in the face of economic pressure and human frailty. The story serves as both celebration and cautionary tale, a reminder of what faith communities can accomplish when they work together, and what they can lose when trust is betrayed. 35 years after the March 24, 1988 confrontation at Mount Calvary Baptist Church, the physical landmarks of the collaboration have largely disappeared. Mount Calvary itself closed in 2003, its building eventually demolished to make way for a community garden. Most of the other participating churches have either relocated, merged, or ceased operations as Detroit's East Side continued its long economic and demographic decline. But the memory of the Detroit Unity Gospel Choir, both its achievements and its tragic ending, remains alive in the stories told by surviving participants and the lessons incorporated into religious education programs throughout the region. The 50 voices that once harmonized across denominational lines achieved a brief but powerful demonstration of what could be possible when faith communities transcended their institutional boundaries to create something beautiful together. The silence that followed their final performance continues to echo as a reminder that unity, once broken, is far more difficult to restore than to destroy. In a city that has faced countless challenges and losses, the collapse of the Detroit Unity Gospel Choir represents one more broken dream, one more reminder of the human capacity for both transcendence and failure. Yet, even in its tragedy, the story offers hope. The music created during the collaboration's 3 successful years touched thousands of lives, inspired other cooperative efforts, and demonstrated that barriers between competing institutions are not insurmountable when people commit to common purposes larger than their individual interests. The harmony achieved, however briefly, proved that such unity remains possible if communities can learn from past failures to build more sustainable foundations for working together.